A myth, it has been said, is a dream gone public. Its purpose is not to convince us of fact, but to help us better understand our lives. Producer Larry Massett wanted to know more about the origin of myths and how they influence us, so he talked with Wendy Doniger, professor of the history of religions at the University of Chicago and a scholar of mythology. But he begins his story on myths with a popular myth from a small town in West Virginia.
5 years ago, a friend of mine showed me an old book he'd found in a junk store. It was called The Mothman Papers, The Mothman Chronicles, something like that. It told how, in the late 1960s, a winged creature known as the Mothman had terrorized the town of Point Pleasant in West Virginia. People came from all over to try to get a look at the creature. Tourists, journalists, photographers, film crews. It must have been great. We thought, my friend and I thought, it would be amusing to go to Point Pleasant and ask people how they felt about the whole thing now. Did they miss the excitement? Were they a little embarrassed about it? Whatever. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. Turns out Point Pleasant is on a point. It's right at the junction of the Kanawha River and the Ohio River. It looks like an old river town that has seen better days. We stayed at the Big Hotel, which was mostly boarded up with cracks in the ceiling and cracks on the floors and weeds coming through the cracks. The first day, the people we ran into were happy to talk about the Mothman.
A man was driving between here and Mason City, which is a town 12 miles north on the Ohio River. He was going rather fast, about 60, and he looked in his mirror, and here was this huge bird, he thought, behind him. So he went faster and attained the speed roughly of 70 miles an hour, and the bird stayed right with him. He couldn't shake the bird. He came back very much agitated and excited and went to his trailer where he and his family lived, and the bird, or whatever the creature was, knocked repeatedly on the trailer and tried to gain admittance, which he did not permit. And that started it all. And then several other people, a boy by the name of Tom Urey, was also followed by this creature. He was in a convertible, and he was scared to death by it. It was called a Mothman, and the theory was that it was in the old power plant at the TNT area, which is not far from town. Some people thought it might have been a mutation from the nitric and sulfuric and other acids used in the making of TNT. Other people thought it was a extraterrestrial creature. There definitely was something there, and it did terrorize the community.
That bird showed up more and more and more. It was huge. I remember once somebody said it had a gargoyle head. People that supposedly saw it professed being frightened, really scared. And there were attempts to explain it, trying to think this is a river country, that the possibility of it being a large osprey, a crane, or something that had come inland this far. Maybe even a niggle. But the nocturnal habits is what fouled up that theory. I don't know of him ever being seen in the daytime. I don't recall him crossing the river. I don't think he was ever seen in Meigs County or Gallia County, which you would think a bird could certainly scoot across the Ohio River without any problem. That bird was parochial. He stayed home.
Now, giant birds, or people with giant wings, are common sightings in the world of cryptozoology. This is how demons are often seen. Angels, too. In Hindu mythology, the god Vishnu flies around on the back of a giant bird, the Garuda. But in Point Pleasant, the Mothman was soon joined by flying saucers.
Up in Braxton County, a saucer did land, and it terrorized the people because the man got out and looked frightful in appearance. Of course, that was his space uniform, which frightened the people, obviously. But I was going to a ball game. I was principal of the high school at the time, going to a ball game at Polka, and we saw this orange-red pulsating object just over the horizon, preparing for land, and that could have well been that saucer coming in.
The flying saucers, like the Mothman, seem to be especially fond of the old TNT plant on the outskirts of town.
Some people thought they might be coming there to get some chemically soaked land, or there might be some residue of which they wanted, or it might pay you gentlemen to go out and look at that power plant. It's a picture of desolation, but walk in there some evening at twilight and you'll see why people got frightened. It's a big, big place.
It's a bunch of ruins is what it is, way back in the woods. Hadn't been used since World War II. But you could tell it was still a popular hangout for either Satanists or high school students. Here are the notes I took.
This is a weird place. It's about the size of a football field and mostly empty spaces now. Cement floors, cement pillars, old broken out glass windows, doors busted out, huge place, frogs falling around the floor, some trash, a lot of paintings on the wall, class of 83, class of such and such, references, a lot of references to love, oral sex, and then huge spray painted murals, some of them pretty good. Let's see, let's go upstairs. Upstairs you have an unobstructed view. At one end, something I take to be, well, maybe the Mothman. It's a huge brown man with claws, black wings, red eyes, and a mouth about where his stomach would be, also red, jumping out at you. It's very big. And at the other end of this building, huge mural, spray paint, fluorescent green, 5 black witches. One has a red heart, one at the end, bleeding red eyes, flames coming out. A huge message in red. It says death.
Have you ever been shut out of a small town, just completely shut out? That's what happened after the first day in Point Pleasant. Nobody would talk to me about the Mothman. People somehow knew ahead of time that I was going to call them, and they were all sick, out of town, walking the dog, couldn't come to the phone right that minute. A woman at the local newspaper said to me, quote, "This is a nice, quiet town, and we want to keep it that way." She actually said that. I couldn't figure out what was wrong until one afternoon, I was poking around in the public library. I came across an old 45 record. On it was the missing piece, the one thing that everybody in town knew but me.
Was up in West Virginia and Conago, Ohio, where the great silver bridge was built so long ago. But one cold December evening, about 5 o'clock, the great silver bridge began to reel and rock. It was sad when that silver bridge went down, and the bars of twisted steel came tumbling to the ground. There were prayers screamed and cried, many people lost their lives. It was sad when that great bridge went down.
What happened was, on December 15, 1967, the height of the Mothman and the flying saucers and all the other weird stuff that was happening, the height of all this, the Silver Bridge, the old bridge across the Ohio River, collapsed. 47 people were killed, I think.
Christmas shopper who had bought so many toys, but now there'll be no Christmas for their orphan girls and boys. It was sad when that silver bridge went down.
Point Pleasant is a small town. Almost everyone must have had a relative or known someone who died when the bridge went down. It wasn't one bit funny. The official investigation found that the bridge collapsed because of metal fatigue. But, under the circumstances...
Now, Mary Hire, who worked for the Messenger, their star reporter, she covered this area, was a dear friend of mine, and she said, prior to the falling of the bridge, she had seen hovering over the bridge an object which she thought was a flying saucer. And she thought, and she was a sensible and analytical person, that there was a connection between the saucer and the collapse of the bridge. I personally believe they were saucer related, but that's just a matter of opinion. I don't think that's improbable at all.
There were prayers, screams, and cries. Many people lost their lives. It was sad when that great bridge went down.
Have you encountered the legend of Cornstalk in Point Pleasant? Well, many people in Point Pleasant put the collapse of the Silver Bridge on the curse of Chief Cornstalk. Every time they've had a flood, and they've had many before they built the flood wall, it was Chief Cornstalk's curse. Bad fires, Chief Cornstalk's curse. An explosion at the boatyards, and so everybody blames Chief Cornstalk.
Oh, yeah, curse. Oh, definitely, yes. The Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774 was between the Virginia militiamen and the Shawnee tribes. The chief of that whole group, of that whole nation of Indians, was Cornstalk, who was highly revered by the Indians. One day he and his son Eleniptico came here to make peace, and some colonist shot him and his son in cold blood. The theory is that he pronounced a curse on the city, and we certainly haven't had too good luck in the past 250 years.
In the public library, I finally found an old program from a pageant. I don't know if it was a high school pageant or put on by the whole town or what. It was from 1925. It must have been quite a show. It opened with the March of the USA Girls, followed by a ballet, The Dawning of Creation, followed by a tableau called Primitive Life Among the Indians, followed by another dance, The Conquering of the Wilderness, with the spirit of the wilderness played by Miss Nedra Wilhelm, and then eventually a drama, The Death of Cornstalk. Here, the story is a little more complicated. There is an Indian princess who is in love with the chief's son and with a white settler, but the end is the same. The chief is murdered. As in Grand Opera, his death in no way prevented him from making a final speech.
I was a friend of the white man. Many a time I have saved him and his people from harm. I never fought, save to protect my wigwams and my lands. I came to your house as a friend, and you murdered me. You have murdered my son, the young chief Elenipsico. For this, may the curse of the Great Spirit rest upon this spot. Favored though it is by nature, may it ever be blighted in its hopes, its growth dwarfed, its enterprises blasted, and the energies of its people paralyzed by the stain of our blood. And so saying, I fall dead by the side of my son.
It's just a story.
Wendy Doniger.
A myth is a story. It's a narrative which says something happened. And it doesn't obviously say why it happened or whether it's good that it happened, who's the hero, who's the villain. It just says once upon a time this happened, this man did this animal did this, and that's why things are the way they are now.
A myth, she argues, is not an idea at all. In fact, it's the opposite of an idea.
Look at Eden. The story as we have it in the Jewish and Christian tradition is that there was this garden, and then there was this tree with this dangerous fruit, and this nasty serpent, and this wicked woman, and the serpent gave the fruit to the man, and that's the beginning of all our troubles. Well, that story about the woman and the fruit and the tree is a very old story in the Near East. And it's the same story, but it's a good tree, it's a good fruit, it's a good serpent, it's a good woman. The whole point of the myth in one culture is the origin of all the good things we have in the world, thanks to that delightful woman and her friend, the helpful serpent. And the story is retold literally in Genesis, but it's a different idea. And I think that's why it's important that myth be a story, because it's a story which can have even the opposite ideas read into it.
Sometimes myths are used to explain stuff like why there's lightning or why the bridge fell down. Mostly they're wrong about these things, and it's no wonder that some people think a myth is just a lie or a mistake. Other times they explain why we do what we do, why people in our tribe don't marry people from your tribe. The story of Chief Cornstalk tries to explain why bad things happen in our town.
But more often, they don't so much explain things at all, but allow you to express things which can't be explained. They really are about, the great myths are about things that can't be explained, like why we're here, why we die, what happens to us when we die, whether there is a God or whether the universe has no mastering intelligence. Those things can't be explained. And that's what myths are about. And they're a way of asking those questions, not answering them, because they can't be answered, but talking about them in a way which make people feel that they have some idea, some inkling of what it's all about. And that to the extent that they're ignorant, that ignorance is shared communally.
I asked Wendy Donegan whether there are American myths, stories that belong to all of us. The answer, in her view, has to be no.
If you accept my definition of the two ingredients of myth, namely that it's a story that's shared by a large community, that defines the community, and that it's a story about these deep and unanswerable questions of meaning, you get American myths that do one or the other. That is to say, there are places in America where people are discussing, telling stories about questions of meaning. Sometimes they just do it in church, after all, the way they always used to do. But that's not universal, you see. The place where there's a shared community is television. So the really universal mythologies, in the sense of the stories that everybody shares, like Dallas, are not deep like old myths. And the places where the deeper and more troubling questions are discussed are not universal in America because of the fragmentation of community here. A lot of Americans don't speak English anymore. I mean, it's very difficult to produce a community. There is no American community anymore.
The result, she says, is that most of us will encounter myth only in the form of other people's myths. It will be an Indian story or a Greek story or Tibetan, never our own story. There may be a real advantage to this. Let's say you hear or you read a Hindu myth about a beautiful princess who falls in love with a hero and one of them dies.
When you read it as how a Hindu fell in love and the lover died, and you're thinking of you falling in love and perhaps a lover who died, you then recast it as happening in Cape Cod and the Lincoln Center. It moves you because it reminds you of your own story, which has your own, not only culturally specific things like Cape Cod and Lincoln Center, but of course your personally specific things, who you were and why you fell in love with that person. And the myth then flickers back and forth between the personal association of the teller of the original story, the cultural associations of his world, and then the bridge, which is the stuff that happens to everybody. And then your cultural associations with stories of that kind, other stories you may have read, like that, for instance, Anna Karenina, which is a Western story about a fatal love affair, and then your own personal feelings. And then what happens, I think, is that when you go on living your life and those things go on happening to you again, and you experience them personally, you fall in love, you watch people die, you understand what's happening to you in terms of the stories that you've already heard. And it might be that you understand it best in terms of that Hindu story, partly because the distancing of the story allows you to use it to express emotions which are so strong that you can't grab them head on. You can't say this is exactly how I feel. You say, I feel like that guy felt in that story. And that's why I think in some cases the foreign story is more effective, because it gets to us. It sneaks around our guard because we can pretend it's not about us, even while we really know that we love it because it is about us.
If you do what she suggests you can do, listen to other people's myths and think through them in your own life, you're bound to notice that stories all over the world have common elements. In a way, the story of Jesus is like the story of Krishna, which is like some other story. This is easy to see, but, she says, it's almost too easy. For example, when her son Michael was 4.5, she was reading Hindu myth to him. Also, C.S. Lewis, the Narnia stories. He was also keen on Batman. As a result, one day he dictated a story to her, which he said was the story of Christmas.
In the old days, no one got presents. There weren't any gods, just good monsters that made things happen. The wicked queen said no one could give presents. They stabbed the queen in the heart, and she died. They fought with the king, and the monsters scratched the king, and out came a piece of paper, and it said, "You can have presents." And then they gave soldiers and things to the children, and the grown-ups gave each other jackets. The queen got alive, and she got good. Batman married her. The queen was dipped in cottage cheese, and the devil ate her. But Batman saved her by punching the devil on the chin, and that's the story of Christmas. That's hardly a great religious classic, and I used it not to argue that anyone is capable of writing a myth, indeed to argue precisely that not many people are capable of composing myths, but to show how, even in the mind of a very little boy, these stories have something in common. I mean, he's the one who thought that the Batman story belonged together with a retelling of an old Hindu myth and a little piece of the Narnia story of the Wicked Queen.
Still, for adults anyway, it may be more fruitful to keep the stories apart and to ask not why they are similar, but why they're different. She also recommends that we resist the temptation to improve on them, even when they are politically incorrect, violent, strange, bloody, or sexist.
The stories that men have told about women in our tradition are terrible stories and encourage very terrifying images of women. However, I see a number of problems in trying to replace them with nice stories about women from other traditions. First of all, there aren't many. It is not a specialty of Judaism and Christianity to tell scary stories about women. The mythologies all over the world are full of terrifying stories about women. The reason that stories about women, myths about women, are so negative is because men's feelings about women are negative for reasons which Freud and others have helped us to understand. Men's feelings about their mothers and so forth. It's hard to change those feelings. You can legislate against behavior. You can stop men from beating their wives, or you can try to stop it. You can stop people from sexually abusing children. But you can't stop the feelings that make men want to beat their wives. And the myths are sometimes just about those feelings. And as long as the feelings exist, those will be felt in the gut and in the groin to be true stories. Myths are stories about how we really feel about the things that trouble us most deeply. So you can't replace those mythologies with new, nice stories. You can tell all the stories you like. It's a free country. But mythologies function at a much deeper and non-political level, I think.
Finally, here's the story of the rabbi from Krakow. I think it's about other people's myths, but of course it means a lot of things. Once upon a time, a poor but virtuous rabbi living in the city of Krakow had a dream. The dream told him to go to a certain foreign city, find a certain bridge, under which was a buried treasure. The rabbi went, found the city, found the bridge, but the bridge was guarded by foreign soldiers. He waited. A soldier came over and asked what he was doing. And the rabbi explained. The soldier laughed. "That's ridiculous," he said. "Dreams don't mean anything. Look, I had a dream last night myself. It told me I should go to the city of Krakow and find a certain Isaac, son of Jekyll, and dig under his house, and I would find a treasure. How stupid." So the rabbi, who was, of course, Isaac, the son of Jekyll, went home, and there, in his own house, he found the treasure.
And for this evening, that's All Things Considered. Our story on myths was produced and narrated by Larry Massett and first aired on Soundprint, the documentary series distributed by American Public Radio. Our editor is Robert Rand. The director is Jane Greenholz. Our program is produced by Dan Collison with help from William Troop, Eve Kupferman, Sarah Saracen, Jeff Rogers, and Kee Molesky. Our technical director tonight is Suzanne Mesnick. Audio engineers are Linda Mack, John Carrillo, Terry Knight, and Stacy Abbott. I'm Brian Naylor. Good evening for All Things Considered.
Support for this program is provided by this and other NPR member stations and the NPR News and Information Fund. Contributors include the Pew Charitable Trusts for historical reporting. For expanded environmental coverage, Church & Dwight Company, maker of pure Arm & Hammer baking soda. Prevention Magazine, America's Family Health Coach. And the Rockefeller Foundation. This program is a production of NPR, which is solely responsible for its content. This is NPR, National Public Radio.